Let me welcome all of you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for taking time out for this latest edition of the Research Frontiers talks. This time we are hosting Professor Bert Hofman, Director of the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. He's also Professor of Practice at the Lee Kuan Yew School. Prior to this, Professor Hofman was the World Bank Country Director for China between 2014 and 2019. He was the country economist for China between 2004 and 2008 and was the chief economist for the World Bank in the East Asia and Pacific region between 2011 and 2014. Today, Professor Hofman would be discussing China's plan in times of COVID-19 and Cold War 2.0. It's useful to remind ourselves that this year happens to be the final year of China's 13th five-year plan. This year also happens to be the completion for the harmonious socialist society policy announced by China in 2006 and targeted for completion, of course, in 2020. Those of you who've been following Chinese politics recently would be aware of the 5th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee of the Communist Party, which was recently held in Beijing in the last week of October, where the Communist Party has expressed satisfaction at the progress they've made towards becoming a middle-income society. This, of course, rides on the back of unequal development that the Chinese economy has seen for most of this decade, growing at roughly 6 to 7% annually. The topic that we've chosen today for discussion becomes important in the context of China's 14th five-year plan, which begins in the new year. And the recent plenary also laid out the policy roadmap for the coming years. So I have a much better person to speak about all of these issues with you. And therefore, without further delay, let me invite Professor Hofman to share his thoughts with us.
Thank you, Professor Thomas. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's a great pleasure to be invited by IIT Madras to give this speech. In the early 2000s, there was a phase where there was a lot of China-India comparison, even started in the 90s. And so I visited India a couple of times to talk about China. But it's the first time that I do it virtually, and I'm very pleased to be able to do so. The topic of today is the plan, and I'm not sure how. I'm sure many of you know, but I still will review a few of the basics of the plan and what it is and what its function is, and then talk more specifically about what we know and understand about what will be in the 14th five-year plan, and then talk a little bit about the international implications of that. So starting with the plan, and the plan is really no longer the plan. It's not the plan from the old planning system. The first plan was issued in 1953. And up until, say, the mid-90s, the plan was a more traditional central planning plan with lots of output indicators, tons of cement, tons of steels, new railways, etc. That's largely gone. And the nature of the plan since the mid-90s has become much more of a strategic plan, still with targets, still with goals, some mandatory for government, most indicative, including, for instance, growth. It used to be a very important, it's still a very important indicator, but it used to be a mandatory or a target growth. It's no longer a target growth, it's an indicative growth target that we've seen. The 13th five-year plan had a growth target of 6.5%. That is actually something that they're not going to meet completely simply because of COVID-19 this year. And even, and Professor Thomas was already referring to it, the growth target of the moderately prosperous society, which was defined in 2012, won't be fully met this year, but by the time of the first centennial, i.e. 2021, July 2021, when China celebrates the 100 years of Chinese Communist Party, by that time they will have met that goal as well. The uh, plenum that we've just seen is the party plenum, and the mechanisms work as such. The plan is actually a government document. The separation between government and party is no longer that clear. It used to be clearer. It was one of the big reforms of Deng Xiaoping to increasingly separate party and government. But under Xi Jinping, that has markedly changed, and now increasingly all of the big policy decisions are being taken in the party rather than the government. And the government plays a subordinate role to the party, as it was in the old days, and for better or for worse. So what we've just seen was a party conference. The Central Committee, the 200 Central Committee members, and there's 190 alternate members, so there was a 300 plus members that were there to discuss the proposals of the plan. Before that, there were a couple of Politburo meetings, and Xi Jinping, who actually gave an explanation of the fifth plenum decisions, which is worth reading, took pride in it that he said he led the drafting committee, which is quite unusual because ever since the 80s, it was actually the vice premier or the premier in charge of the economy that would help prepare, if you want, the guidance of the party to for the plan. So Xi Jinping, decides a lot nowadays, and he also helped draft the recommendations. So there were two outputs of the plenum meeting. One was the communique, and that came almost the day that it was closed, and that gave a very brief outline of what was discussed. Meanwhile, there's also the recommendations for the 14th five-year plan and the long-term goals. It's a long name for that document. So it has two aspects: recommendations of the party for the 14th five-year plan and the long-term goals. Now, these long-term goals, they come from somewhere, and they basically come from the 19th Party Congress that was held in 2017, where Xi Jinping, in his report of the General Secretary to the Congress, stated or declared the new era. And the new era has two phases: phase one until 2035, and the next phase until 2049, which would be the second centennial. In this, the second document, there are these long-term recommendations, if you want a vision, a more detailed vision on the end of the first phase of the new era. So that's the context of the plan. Now let's look at the recommendations a little bit. And of course, the immediate context is quite important. And the title of my speech already talks about that. As the Chinese would say, it is an increasingly complex external environment. And there's two very big factors in that environment. One is COVID-19. I know India is still very much affected. China is out of it, but is still economically affected because the world economy is not doing so well. And furthermore, it's not just the economic side. The Chinese leadership has also observed that there is a lot of political turmoil in the context of COVID in the United States, but in many other countries where, if you want, the political processes have been disturbed by COVID, and a lot of the existing issues have come to the fore in the context of the COVID crisis. And China is aware of that. Changes not seen in a century is another one of these lines that has come back already a number of times in speeches, but China sees it largely as an opportunity. That's, of course, unfortunate in a way for the rest of the world to put it like that, but China says, well, look, there's so many changes ongoing, and that, has an opportunity for China to become more prominent internationally and to get their house in order domestically. The second external factor is, of course, the trade war, the tech war, or however, not yet a Cold War, but the increasingly tense relationship between China and the United States, and the increasingly tendentious relationship between China and Europe. I mean, Europe is also changing to some extent, in part because catalyzed by COVID, and they are reassessing their relationship with China as we speak. But the center is the US-China tension. None of that is mentioned in the documents, but of course it is very much on everybody's mind. In that context, the recommendations of the party for the plan are focusing on what is dubbed as the new development pattern. And it has become known as the dual circulation theory, which was first raised in May this year. And what it really implies is that China thinks that going forward it has to rely more on domestic demand, more on domestic supply chains, in part for security reasons, but in part also for economic reasons. And it has to rely more on domestic innovation, on domestic technology, given the risk of being cut off or having less access to technologies from abroad. Of course, China has been very effective, some would say a bit overambitious, in absorbing technology from abroad by means of FDI, by means of cooperation around the world on technology. And they see going forward that may be less the case, and the opportunities may become less. And there's indeed, and there's the Huawei case and the other cases where there's actually serious threats to Chinese companies of being cut off from essential technology. So this innovation, domestic innovation, is an important plank in the recommendations. It has been also in the 13th five-year plan, and China did relatively well. They had a target of growing their research and development budget to 2.5% of GDP. They don't quite make that, but they've come a long way. And their capabilities in terms of university graduates, and in terms of number of researchers, in terms of number of patents and number of publications is rising exponentially, I would say. Going forward, they want to do more of that because they feel that they are at risk of relying too much on foreign technology. Now, on the demand and supply side, domestic demand has been an important factor in China's growth. And frankly, in a way, with the dual circulation, there's nothing new. China has decreased its reliance on trade already quite dramatically over the past 12, 13 years, ever since the global financial crisis. Its current account surpluses have reduced dramatically from more than 10% of GDP in 2007 to now barely 1% of GDP. The share of total trade in manufacturing went from 50% of exports and imports, went from 50% of GDP to now 30% of GDP, which is equivalent to the European Union, and it's not as low as the United States at 20%, but it's declining, and in a way that is quite natural for countries the size of China and for countries that are becoming richer. One very economic reason for that is that as you start growing, you start demanding more domestic goods, services are becoming more important in your GDP, and then simply your services in also becoming more expensive because wages are rising, and then automatically actually the share of trade in GDP becomes less. The significance of trade in GDP becomes less. So in a way, it's to some extent a statement of what is already happening, but at the same time, there is an intent to push this further because of the risk of supply disruption from abroad, because of the risk of dropping off demand in light of the trade tensions. And if you look at 2019, the year before COVID, for instance, China's exports to the United States dropped by almost 15%. And in the COVID year, it also dropped, but it's a bit messy in terms of the data. What that brings in terms of growth and in terms of quantity growth, can China keep up a high growth rate? Well, that remains to be seen. That's one. That also remains to be seen on how efficient it can produce its own technology, how efficient it can be in investment, and how effectively can it raise domestic demand. There's quite a few questions. One factor in domestic demand hasn't done so well, and that is consumption. In most societies, household consumption is the big engine of demand. In China, that's not the case. In China, household consumption is below 40% of GDP. In the United States, it would be something like 70% of GDP. There's a lot a lot of upward potential, one would say, but China has been trying and hasn't been trying very effectively up until now. It has to do with complex issues in income distribution, as Professor Thomas already mentioned, but also the share of labor in the economy, the profitability of state enterprises that whose returns are not being used for common use, for pension systems or something, but for investment. So there's a lot of distortion still, a lot of reform still to be had to get consumption up in society. The other big divide is that affects consumption is the hukou system, because migrants don't consume as much as they would have wanted because they can't really settle in urban areas. Whole range of reasons why consumption in China is quite low, and it remains to be seen whether that catches up. Meanwhile, investment is very high in China. It's almost 45% of GDP. And as one policymaker once said to me, well, the problem is if I don't invest I have a savings rate of 45% of GDP, and if I don't invest 45% of GDP, I will have very large current account surpluses and everybody will complain. But to invest 45% of GDP effectively is very hard. And frankly, there's lots of evidence that some of that investment is wasted. And that, of course, has implications for long-term growth. On the growth, I said the growth target used to be a very important part of the plan, even if it were an indicative plan. It's still to be seen whether the plan, as it is going to be published next March, will include a growth target, but it's definitely de-emphasized in the documents that are out for now. And the quality of growth is a far more important issue than if you want the quantity of growth. Nevertheless, after the plenum, Xi Jinping he wrote an explanation, and he talked about the 2035 goals. And basically, he said, look, there's no reason why China would not once again double its GDP and once again double its GDP per capita until 2035. If that were to happen, then you're talking about a growth rate of something in the order of 4.7, 4.8% over the next 15 years, much less than the past 10 years, where it was more than 7% on average, and less than the 6.5 of the 13 five-year plan, but still a relatively high growth rate. And so the growth rate is probably not going to completely disappear. A second plank in the recommendations of the party for the plan is common prosperity. It's the sharing of growth. It is creating more equality. As Professor Thomas said, China has had an issue of income distribution, and income distribution became very unequal in the course of reforms. Income inequality has come down, but it's definitely that some benefit more than others. For the 13 five-year plan, the elimination of extreme poverty was a goal, and by and large that will be achieved. But that doesn't mean that you would get rid of all the inequalities. And frankly, extreme poverty is a very low target. So undoubtedly, the aspirations will increase with regard to the poverty line, with regard to who will be considered as poor. But inequality is still very much the urban-rural inequality that pertains throughout Chinese system. The hukou system is one basis of it, but also the education system in the countryside is not as good as you would expect. The health system is not as good as you would expect. Social security is far more minimal in the rural areas compared to the city areas. And so if China were to seriously address those issues, one could expect less inequality, and also one could expect more consumption. Because frankly, if you give very poor people more money, they'll consume it. And to give you one idea, the basic pension system, which is now by and large for everybody, but the basic pension system in the countryside is 120 yuan per month. So that is something like $20 per month, and that's not a lot of money for China in today. So but nevertheless, it is an area that will require a lot of attention, and it was mentioned in the recommendations. The third area is environment. Actually, surprisingly little came into the recommendations for the plan, and the expectations were relatively high because Xi Jinping, just before the fifth plan, have given a speech at the UN where China made a very strong commitment, a very important commitment to net zero carbon by 2060. And you think, well, 2060 is far away, but if you think about that the coal-fired power plants last for 50 years, you have to start thinking about net zero today. That was not at all reflected in the recommendations. Lots of ideas on how to further improve the environment, but actually the recommendations only reflected the old commitment of China that they would peak in their carbon emission before 2030 and then decline. That hasn't changed. I hope that will change in the final plan, because if China doesn't start working on that net zero today, they won't make it by 2060. The final area that I want to highlight is on governance, and there's a domestic governance area to it, and that is it's a topic that has come back many times in China's discussion. It's this balance between the government and the state-driven development, and then the market-driven development. And clearly, under Xi Jinping, if you want, the balance has shifted more towards the government-driven development, the state-owned enterprises, and domestic governance has increasingly become regulating the market. The recommendations still repeat this line, which has been around for a long time, that the market should be the decisive factor in allocating production factors. But it's clear from this document and from some other documents that China wants to really manage that market very well, so that stability and security is assured, and that there should be enough guidance for the market to come out with the correct outcome. And just to put it very concretely, Jack Ma from Ant Financial just got some guidance from the regulators, and it meant that his IPO could not go forward. So that was an extreme case, but clearly there is a concern, an existing concern in China's policymakers, that the market has to be really well guided. One can think about that in many ways. One is a positive way, that yes, markets, especially financial markets, they require good regulations, but there's also a little bit of even a political economy explanation is that there are strong interests in the state sector to keep the non-state sector, or to keep the private sector at bay, because they're usually more competitive, they have higher returns, and they would do better if they would have all the freedom in the world. And financial is also one example of that. Internationally, and I find that a very interesting part, one of my research themes is China in international organizations. And internationally, the document, the recommendations document, talks quite a bit on international governance and China's role in that. And very, in a very open and transparent manner, China says, look, we want to take the lead in environmental governance. We want to take the lead in establishing new regulations and international agreements on emerging technologies. which is an important factor in the whole tech conflict with the United States. And they want to take the lead in reforming economic governance institutions. They mentioned particularly the WTO, but they also mean the IMF and my former employer, the World Bank. And in a way, you would say that, well, that's very fair. China is the second largest economy in the world, and they, in a way, they punch below their weight, especially in IMF and World Bank, but in some other areas as well. And if you want the incumbent powers, they want to, in a way, they want to sort of keep everything the same, and that is an unrealistic assumption in today's world. But at the same time, it makes the incumbent powers very nervous about what China wants to do with these international organizations. The US, until recently, almost opted out of the international system and gave, therefore, a lot of space for China. Probably under the Biden government, when it comes into power in January next year, things will be different. And if you want, there will be more countervailing balances towards China's ambitions in those international organizations. So that's one international aspect. The other aspect, implication for the rest of the world, is really in this dual circulation theory. And to what extent will China still be open to the outside world? And to what extent could outsiders, other countries, benefit from, if you want, a stronger domestic demand from China? If China only wants domestic demand that is met by domestic supply, that would not be necessarily good for the rest of the world. The statements in the communique and in the recommendations say, no, we're also open and we want to continue to reform and open up. And we have lots of tools and lots of means for it. But my reading is that they're far less optimistic about that part of the reforming opening up, and they are afraid that the world will go through a phase of more protectionism and deglobalization, if you want, and that therefore, as a consequence, they need to build the domestic capacity. But the effect of that would be that the rest of the world would benefit less from China's growth, maybe, than in the past. Those are open questions, and I'm happy to discuss them further. But those are the initial takes on, for me, on the plan in times of trade wars and COVID. Thank you. Looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Hofman, for the interesting comments you've had on the blueprint that China is planning to lay out as it begins the 45-year plan at the start of the new year. I have one question which is there in the chat box, and let me just announce it for the benefit of the audience. You can pose your questions to the speaker by sending in your question in the chat box, and please identify yourself, indicate your name and affiliation after the question, and we'll be happy to raise it up with the speaker. So the first question here is that the fifth plenum recently emphasized on developing cultural soft power, agricultural and rural revitalization. How is this linked to Xi Jinping's focus on the four comprehensives? Is it linked to self-reliance strategies that they have for technology, security and military modernization? And in the present context, how do you feel China would reposition itself in the global economic governance and tech innovation paradigms?
That's a very big question. It's a very interesting question as well. I'm not sure how it actually links to the four comprehensive. Four comprehensive is one of the standard lines and the six stabilities and the six guarantees. But what is striking is indeed there's a lot of emphasis on cultural development in the document, and my interpretation is that in part it is domestic control, i.e. It has to be the right culture that is being learned, but at the same time, and you know, there's clear conflicts there. We've just recently seen the issues around the Mongolian language in Inner Mongolia, which is one expression of how the leadership thinks about culture. And it's much more homogeneous culture than, if you want, the diverse culture that is proclaimed in the constitution, as well as in the laws on minorities, etc. But I think there's also indeed the soft power element is being emphasized in this culture, and I'm no expert. My wife is a filmmaker, so she's much more of an expert than me. But in the cultural sphere, China actually has difficulties in projecting soft power abroad, and that is an issue. I don't think their diplomacy is helping in that, and some of their, of course, their domestic policies do not help at all in projecting soft power abroad. And China's cultural space is quite restricted. I also have some friends in the cultural business in China, and the conditions are not such that you can expect as thriving a cultural environment as, say, for instance, in Korea, which has done remarkably well. So I think there the link. I understand the link. I understand how China thinks about developing its culture so that people understand better China and there will be more soft power. I'm not sure whether they're on the right track. On agriculture and rural revitalization, those are, if you want, existing policies. The rural revitalization has become more prominent under Xi Jinping, and that's not altogether a good thing. And President Xi has been very clear that he has been clear that he's been ambivalent about urbanization. Yes, on the one hand, there needs to be urbanization, but on the other, too large a cities is not good, and that's a potential pool of unrest. So there is this strand in China's current development is that let's just develop the countryside so that people can find jobs there, and then they don't need to come to the city. The policy alternative would be, let's just give up hukou system and let everybody move where they are most productive, and then deal with the consequences. That was the approach that Japan took, that Korea took in their rapid growth and rapid urbanization phase, and they by and large came out fine. One could say, well, it was a bit too unbalanced, fair enough, but if you exclude the biggest cities, one can do that quite efficiently, and you would indeed have people move to those parts where they're most productive. When you sort of encourage to go to the countryside, you may still have a pretty good life, but it may not be as good for development and growth of the country compared to if you can move to the city. On the global governance, it's very interesting. I mean, as a former staff member of the World Bank, I saw some of that repositioning, and the World Bank is a bit special. It's a shareholding bank, and the United States has the largest shares, and the shares are determined on the basis of a number of factors, including GDP, but not just GDP. And China has been very patient. If you want. China has had an underrepresentation in the World Bank and in the IMF, unlike the UN, where it's one country, one vote, and China's prominence in the UN has progressed far more rapidly than in World Bank and IMF. Look, I work too long on China, but I actually think that China has a lot to offer in terms of thinking about development. China has a lot to offer in terms of investment capital for the world, and increasingly China has a lot to offer also in the area of technology. And yes, there are issues in each and every one of them, but I also believe that international organizations are exactly the spot where those things need to be addressed, are exactly the spot where common norms and standards need to be fleshed out, where security issues, such as there are with technology, need to be addressed, where environmental and governance issues with infrastructure investments, such as in the Belt and Road Initiative, they would need to be addressed. So it's in a way much better to have China in those tents, in those multinational tents, and have a good debate and in the end an agreement on what should be the norms that we can all live by, and then enforce it, rather than having almost sort of avoiding the issue or trying to set clubs, smaller clubs, where we're going to do this and we're not going to look at the rest of the world. So I'm a strong proponent of multilateralism. I think to some extent, if you want, the West or the incumbent people in power have not been welcoming enough to China, and for that matter, for other emerging markets. India is a similar thing. India is growing rapidly. Its share in the world economy is growing, yet they don't seem to be as strongly represented in a number of international organizations. That's a difficult discussion, but sometimes it becomes really petty. I mean, there are small countries, and again, I've seen it live in the World Bank, small countries where they say, well, we can't give up our shareholding in the World Bank, because then we might lose our chair at the board. Well, that's a parochial argument that does not help the world. So I think that debate is very important, and I think one would find much more common ground if you were to discuss it in international forum. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. We have another question from Madhu. She wants you to discuss how do you perceive the China-European Union relations in the present context? And by present context, I'm assuming she's referring to the increasing decoupling of relations between the United States and China.
Yeah, it's a very important question, very important issue for China. And it's my assessment that actually over the past 5 years, the EU's attitude towards China has changed. Actually, for some it has been longer, but the EU has become more skeptical towards China. And some of the documentations of the European Commission, they also have issued a China strategy, just like the US. It's not as sharply worded as the US, but clearly China is also seen to some extent as a rival, but the EU still has three aspects of China. They say there's a rival, a competitor, and a partner. So there's not just a rival, what you hear from the United States. But increasingly, there is some skepticism on how China has behaved itself vis-a-vis the EU. It's foreign direct investment in the EU. What the EU has seen as sort of the cherry picking of European technologies for Chinese purposes, the non-reciprocity in regulations of market access and investment access. And I think all these things are quite important. And then in the context of COVID, China probably overreached and overplayed its hand, where it was quite heavy-handed in terms of, if you want, the non-monetary conditions for support and provision of the personal protection equipment and medical equipment, and that really soured some of the relations. Therefore, there was a recent visit, actually two visits, from Wang Yi and Yang Jiechi, the state councilor on foreign affairs, and those were not successful. And the summit, the EU-China summit that was supposed to take place live in Leipzig early in the year, it didn't happen, but then it became an online summit. But it was not a success. And the big clincher was supposed to have been the China-EU investment agreement. that was not ready for signature. So clearly, there is more. There is a rising issues between the EU and China, and so unlike China's initial thinking may have been, well, even if the U.S. we increasingly are confrontational with the U.S., we can find partners in the EU, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So China would need to address concerns from both sides.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. The next question is from my friend and colleague here at IIT Madras. Subhash asks that there is an apprehension that China may fall into a middle income trap, and this has been there since the 2008 financial crisis. He's asking how likely is this argument, how likely is it to hold since the onset of the current pandemic?
Okay, let me go on record. Very unlikely. Very unlikely. I mean, if almost everything that I see in China makes me very confident that they will become a high-income country, that they will continue to grow. Of course, in a scenario in which there is an aggravation of the tensions between China and the rest of the world, or China and the US, growth will be less, but it will still be positive given China's domestic capabilities. There's a lot of debate on the middle income trap, and some of my colleagues, two of my colleagues are actually responsible. My former colleagues are responsible for the concept, Homi Karas and Inder McGill, and it's a great concept to sell reform. Saying, oh, you better reform because otherwise you come into the middle income trap. But if you look at what it takes for a country to go from low income to middle income, especially to high middle income, where China now is, it's quite unlikely, quite rare that those countries do not make it to high income. At the same time, it is a fact that not that many countries go from low income to high income. There's no question about that. Some countries get stuck, and sometimes there's a very idiosyncratic reason. Sometimes the war plays a role, but quite often it's macroeconomic mismanagement. And if you want, the Latin American countries that got stuck in middle income, the Brazils of the world and the Argentinas of the world, they in the end got stuck because of lots of macroeconomic instability. China is not out of the woods there, and there's a lot of concern about China's macroeconomy. I'm personally less concerned. You can always think about policy mistakes. One of the big vulnerabilities right now is the financial sector. It's very much on the agenda. It's one of the three decisive battles of Xi Jinping. So it's not that they don't realize that there is risk. The Jack Ma episode was actually a reflection of that risk. They were just concerned that this ant financial might be too destabilizing, so they wanted to slow that down or to better regulate. But debt to GDP overall is quite high. But in a way, that's also a reflection of China's very high savings rate. If you save 45% of GDP, and 30% of GDP of that is household savings, that has to be channeled through the banking system to investment, you automatically build up debt to GDP. The question is, are your investments efficient enough to keep this all sustainable? Up until now, yes, but efficiency of investment is going down. Rates of returns on capital is coming down. So China does need that different growth pattern, more based on productivity increases, less on investment, more on innovation, less on mobilization of labor, which is no longer a growth factor. There's no question that the policymakers have realized that's the movement. And I think they've moved quite far along in that direction that would help them avoid the macroeconomic middle income trap. One can always think about policy mistakes. One of the big decisions where China has been thinking about is, for instance, the opening up of the capital account. It's one of those things where if you do that too prematurely, then you might actually create macroeconomic instability, which might kill growth. But have been quite careful there, which has set back internationalization of the RMB, but probably that was a good price to pay. So on balance, I think it's quite unlikely that China were to fall into a middle income trap. And frankly, uh, um, by the end of the 14 5-year plan, there will be high income according to World Bank definition. They're right now at $10,400 per capita, and the World Bank definition for whatever it's worth is something like 12,500 per capita. So if they would only grow with 3.5 or 4% over the next 5 years, they would make that high income threshold.
Right. Thank you, Professor Hofman. The next question is again from my friend and colleague here at IIT Madras. Solly Benjamin has a question on China's urbanization. Is there any thinking about the autonomy of local and provincial governments in China, especially because in the past, some East Coast regions have mobilized urbanization by linking it to economic development?
That's a good question. I mean, it's not autonomy in a political sense in any kind of way. I mean, every leader at every level of government is, of course, a party member, but within the overall framework of the party and within the broad policy guidance that, say, a 14 5-year plan or party documents give, there is quite a large amount of autonomy for local leaders everywhere. Then there is the special regions, the special economic zones or the special trade zones or the free trade zones that give an additional level of autonomy in areas where other parts of the country do not have autonomy. And then the if you want the controlling factor is the evaluation of local party officials. So if you're looking for your next job in the party and you want to move up, or you want from a municipal mayor you want to move up to a deputy governorship, you get evaluated, and those evaluations are pretty. I don't say they're without problems, but you get your report card and may the best win. So there is autonomy, and then there is accountability. It's upward accountability. It's within the party. It's not democratic accountability as India knows or as many other countries know, but there is an accountability there. That seems to have worked really well for China. Now, and it works especially well in a context in which you want to mobilize resources, in which you want to get investment going, in which you want to get more people employed, in which you want to get foreign investment and create links to the outside world. In my view, it works less well once you start actually in the current and future phase of China's development. If you want to have a coherent industrial policy, if you want to focus your resources for innovation, that's not sort of an equal decentralized level of growth. And if you look at some of the countries, or I'd say economies that have tried to manage that, they come out very differently. Like the EU is a good example. The EU has very strict rules on individual country support for industries, individual country support for R&D, so as not to become sort of a negative-sum game. In China, you see some of that negative-sum games appearing. When in the 90s, China was planning for its car industry, they thought that 3 or 4 big car companies would be sort of good for China, basically copying the US model. Well, they ended up with 72 car companies. Why? Because every province and some of the municipal mayors wanted to have that car company. Integrated circuits is another area. It's now quite prominent, and China has been in the past investing a lot of money into the production of integrated circuits. It means that they end up with a suboptimal scale because every mayor or every governor in the country wants that. Even if you look at infrastructure, any self-respecting governor now wants high-speed rail through all of its cities. But high-speed rail to all of the cities is very much below efficient level. So the first 20,000 kilometers of high-speed rail is probably good. the next 20,000 will not be as good economically. But that competition between regions also has a downside, also has an inefficient side, and that may become more important as China is changing its growth model. So, but China still likes to use its decentralization for experiments. So that's why the free trade zones, it sounds strange, free trade zones, but it really is sort of laboratories for experimentation in policy in a number of areas. They continue to play a role, and there's now about 20 of them. Hainan Island is one. There's the free trade zone in Shanghai that they started with a number of years back, 5-6 years back. That's sort of the new phase of reforms, as China says, and some of that might still be useful.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. I thought I'll reserve the last question for myself since I don't see any more questions coming in. I quite agree with you for the case that you made out for multilateralism, and you just mentioned how provinces seem to be in competition with each other as far as integrated circuits are concerned, and likewise for many other industries. In this context, it came to my mind that in the field of technology, China now is facing a lot of overseas resistance. Chinese companies increasingly, I mean, it's not just Huawei or ZTE, it would be a range of Chinese companies that would, in the coming years, face more resistance overseas. It's not limited to the United States. Now, with the recent ban on Chinese apps in India, and you mentioned that even the relationship with the EU did not take off in terms of the visits for Yang Jiechi and Wang Yi that you mentioned. I was wondering if this is the context of overseas resistance to Chinese technology, would the Chinese have enough with them by depending on the Belt and Road Initiative and focusing on just those countries to absorb their technology? Would it be enough for them? Or would the Chinese also have to develop a preference for continued multilateralism and find ways to sort of avoid any kind of decoupling from happening?
Well, I think there's no question that the preference of China's leadership and also the interest of the economy is to maintain the integrity of the world economy, an integrated world economy. The reality is that this is not an easy time to argue that, and the facts on the ground are moving in a different direction. So in a way, it's a strategic choice. Yes, it would be great if Huawei can continue to rely on integrated circuits of Qualcomm and others, U.S. firms. But if that's no longer possible, what do you do? So the trade war by itself, the tech war, is sparking more domestic innovation. And frankly, as I wrote in my piece on the plan, necessity is the mother of invention, and I think the pressure is really on. So, but that risks something that nobody in a way wants. That is a decoupling in a technical sense. So even if a Biden government comes in and says, "Well, let's all be friends again," I don't expect that to happen, by the way. But to have a more positive attitude and see some of those pathways towards common standards and appropriate technology with taking security concerns into account, and I think they exist. But if that doesn't happen, then China doesn't have China says, okay, well, we're just going to do it ourselves. Then there's two things to know. I mean, one, China is already a very, very large economy, and so economies of scale don't seem to sort of be the main bottleneck anymore, or a development path that is far more indigenous innovation. Second, the technical capabilities. Yes, they may not be at the very top, but China is pretty impressive in terms of what it can stage in its research capabilities, in its research labs. There's lots of international research labs actually in China. Why? Because the talent is there. I mean, not dissimilar from India, where there's lots of talent and lots of international research. China can use that for its domestic purposes. It doesn't even need the Belt and Road to realize that. But of course, the Belt and Road can be one avenue, and there's a number of countries that would for sure be quite happy to link up with, if you want, the Chinese technology ecosystem as compared to the West. Frankly, they don't really care. And there's only a few countries in the world that care about the security that comes with Huawei or the insecurity that comes with Huawei. So there would be a market for Chinese goods along many of the Belt and Road countries, no question. I mean, the list is very long at the moment. I don't know how many Belt and Road countries there are, but if you sort of think that there's maybe around 50 to 60 as a core Belt and Road. I mean, there's 127 countries that have signed MOUs with Belt and Road in, but probably the core is much smaller. But even if that were not to succeed, China still has a 1.4 billion people economy, second largest in the world, $10,000 per capita, very rapidly growing middle class. It will be less efficient growth without foreign technology, but I think it will still be growth.
Thank you, Professor Hofman. It was an absolute treat, and I think I speak on behalf of every single person in the audience that it was wonderful to hear you speak, and also the replies that you gave. It's rarely that we get a speaker who's willing to stick their neck out and say, for instance, that there will be no middle-income trap that China gets to face. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank members of my team here at IIT Madras who made this possible. Yamuna, our project staff, Ramnath, Adira, Ashna, our PhD scholars, Amartya, who's also a former IIT Madras student currently in LSE. So I'd like to thank my team here, and once again, I join the audience members in thanking you, Professor Hofman, for taking time out for this special event. Thank you very much.
It was my great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.